will you be? What kind of leader will you be? Michael Rodman.
Walk into any bookstore, assuming you can still find one, and you'll see shelves full of books on leadership. And they all have different perspectives and different takes on leadership. I did a Google search to find out how many books on leadership there were, and there were over 24 million. Does anybody here want to read 24 million books? Well, if you started reading 1,300 books a day, it would take you over 15 years to read all of those books. I've read a few, not 24 million, but a few. And I found there are 3 basic categories in which you can put most leaders. There's the dictator, there's the inspiration, and the example. Now, the dictator, their primary purpose is having that power. Do what I say because I'm in charge. I'm the boss. Some new managers may find themselves in that dictator role simply because they don't know how to be managers and they're under pressure to perform. We've all worked for a dictator at one point or another, probably. I certainly have. And one thing that I know about all the dictators I've worked with, they have 2 primary things in common. One, their employees hate them. If you're the subject of a dictator, no matter how good their intentions are, you see them as a dictator. And the second thing is that they often find that their team is underperforming the teams of their peers. History has given us some examples of dictators. We have Julius Caesar from Rome, Benito Mussolini from Italy, and Mohammad Najibullah from Afghanistan. And being a dictator doesn't often work out well for the dictator. Julius Caesar was stabbed by the Senate. Benito Mussolini was dragged behind a car till dead. His body was hung upside down and he was pummeled with rocks like a demented piñata. And Mohammad Najibullah was beaten and killed, and then his body was hung upside down from a street post. If you want to be a dictator, go ahead, but you probably find yourself murdered, or even worse, out of a job. I've always wanted to be an inspiration. I've had a few of those in my working life. The first one I encountered had the philosophy that if he helped other people to achieve their goals, he would naturally achieve his. Curtis was one of my managers. He took the time to get to know me, find out what my dreams and goals were. He helped me to discover my strengths and also my weaknesses. And then he gave me some advice on things that I could do to improve myself and to become a better leader. He suggested that I read some books, and he suggested some of those 24 million that we talked about earlier. He also suggested that I join Toastmasters. Curtis was such an inspiration to me that not only did I start reading more books on leadership, but I got 20 people together at work and started a Toastmasters club without ever having been to a meeting. The example is somewhat lesser known. You probably know several examples in your life, and you may not even realize that's what they are. And they're okay with that. They're not after acknowledgement or power. Their goal is simply living a good life and being an example to others. Curtis was a good example to me on how to be an inspirational leader. But there's another example more important in my life. That was my grandfather, Bill. When my dad was very young, his father died. And Bill was one of the gentlemen in the church. He stepped in to help raise my dad. When my dad was struggling with alcoholism, I stayed with him for a time, slept on his couch many nights. Bill was kind-hearted, and he would take me out to the arcade. It was one of my favorite things to do as a kid. And one day, I realized what his example had done in my life. I was playing one of those racing games where you sit down and you drive way faster than is safe to do on the city streets. I took this corner, I was in first place, and I was going way too fast, and I crashed into the buildings on the side of the road. I said something I shouldn't have said. And immediately I knew that was not the kind of language Bill would approve of. Bill never talked to me about cursing. But he modeled a life where I knew that getting that upset about things to where you felt like you had to curse was not the right kind of life and not the kind of life I wanted to live. Bill was a good example for me. I've had bad examples in my life as well. My father, as I mentioned, struggled with alcoholism for a time. And during that part of his life, he was a bad example. I remember when I was 7 years old, he took me with him to the bar. I sat out in the car, and he brought me a cherry Coke from inside. It was the best cherry Coke I've ever had. It even had a real cherry in it. Oh, so good. But that's not a good example for a child on how to be a father. He later turned his life around. He overcame alcoholism, and he modeled for me that no matter what kind of mistakes you make in your life, it's never too late to change. My father became a good example for me. Now, whether you choose to be a dictator or an inspiration, maybe read some books or join a club where you can go and practice leadership skills. Whether you choose to do either of those things, you are an example to someone. Maybe even someone in this room. You could choose to be a good example, or you can choose to be a bad example. What kind of leader will you be?